In this presentation, we are moving on to the central nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. These two organs have common embryological origins that we'll talk about later. Basically, they start off as a tube in the embryo that expands at the head end to form the brain. So our spinal cord begins at the foramen magnum. The tissue in the spinal cord is a direct extension of the brain stem. The spinal cord descends through the vertebral foramen and generally decreases in diameter as it descends. It will finally terminate in a bundle of nerve roots called the cauda equina in the sacral region of the spinal cord. Both the brain and the spinal cord are surrounded by membranes that we call meninges. They are listed here in order from superficial to deep: the thick dura mater, the sort of cobwebby arachnoid mater, and the pia mater, which is in intimate contact with the brain and the spinal cord. The pia mater hugs all the convolutions and curves of the central nervous system. In this sectional view, the illustration at the top shows us that there are spaces between the meninges, and the bottom view is nested within a vertebra, and we see there's quite a bit of space between the vertebra and the dura mater. That epidural space is filled with adipose tissue. Within the CNS, we have gray matter and white matter. Gray matter would be the neurons and their processes, principally axons, that are not myelinated. The white matter would be myelinated axons. Now, the absence of myelin in the gray matter makes it easier for synaptic connections to occur. The presence of myelin in the white matter speeds up the rate of impulse conduction along axons from one part of the CNS to another. So I kind of like to think of gray matter as local traffic, where things are moving a little slower, but you can turn on and off of streets easily, whereas the white matter would be more like areas that are interstates, where the traffic is moving faster, but you have more limited access. In the spinal cord, the gray matter is concentrated in the center, in this sort of butterfly-shaped area. We will see that in the brain, the gray matter is actually on the outside and the white matter is on the inside. Now, when we focus on the white matter of the spinal cord, we can identify regions called tracts. And these tracts are basically bundles of axons where the information is all traveling in the same direction. Ascending tracts are axons that are conducting impulses up toward the brain. This is sensory information coming from the peripheral nervous system and being conducted up these ascending tracts. Descending tracts are motor impulses traveling down axons toward effectors in the peripheral nervous system. So if you've already studied the lab images of the spinal cord, you know that the white matter is organized into these columns or funiculi. We have a posterior or dorsal, a lateral, and an anterior column of gray matter on both the right and left side. This is an actual photograph of a preserved spinal cord. In the next image, we're going to follow an ascending tract that is on the left side in the anterior or ventral column of white matter. This is an ascending tract pathway. Remember, ascending is sensory. So it starts off with, in the lower right, a bit of skin, receptors in the skin. They're being stimulated. Threshold is crossed in that axon. Action potentials are generated and conducted through a sensory axon in a spinal nerve. That axon enters the dorsal root and makes a synaptic connection with the cell body of another neuron in the gray matter, in that posterior horn of gray matter. Now notice how the axon of that second neuron crosses over to the left side and then enters an ascending tract. This particular one is called the spinal thalamic tract, and that impulse is conducted up that long axon that's traveling up the spinal cord until it makes another synaptic connection in the brain in the region called the thalamus. And then the impulse will travel up to the cerebral cortex, where you will be made aware of that sensation. You will process that information. This figure features a descending tract. It's called the cortical spinal tract. Here, an impulse is originated in the cerebral cortex. That's your conscious, awake, thinking part of your brain. And you have this thought, I want to move a muscle. So those impulses are originated. They travel down axons through a descending tract and make a synaptic connection in the local neighborhood of where that muscle is. And a motor impulse travels out through a motor neuron, through the ventral root of the spinal nerve, to reach the effector, which is a skeletal muscle. So this complex of images, A is kind of a cartoony view of the spinal cord. We can see the gray matter, the white matter. We can see the roots of spinal nerves. B is actually, again, a cross-section through a preserved human spinal cord. And C is identifying where within the columns of white matter are these ascending in blue and descending in pink tracks. So notice the arrows, the directions that impulses are traveling in axons within these tracks. Now, when we start to tie together some of these ideas, that sensory information comes in, synaptic connections are made in the gray matter, motor information goes out, we can put this together and talk about a spinal reflex arc. A reflex arc is a nerve pathway, the actual pathway that electrical impulses will travel that allow for a reflex. A reflex is an involuntary action. The basic pattern of a reflex arc is mapped out on this figure. So we see the green sensory neuron would be conducting an impulse in from a receptor, enters the dorsal root, makes a connection with an interneuron, a neuron totally contained within the gray matter, that makes a synaptic connection with a motor neuron whose axon exits the ventral root and travels out to an effector. The components of a reflex arc are mapped out more specifically in this figure, right? So again, we're using the skin as an example of a receptor. We have a skeletal muscle as an example of the effector, that is the target. So a stimulus received at the skin might result in an involuntary motion as that skeletal muscle is stimulated to contract. Now in some of the following figures, we will see something that relates back to an idea from our previous lecture, the idea of convergent and divergent pathways. So some axons branch, and when branching axons innervate multiple effectors, you can have a divergent pathway. You could have, for example, sensory information coming in and not only causing a reflex, but also making a connection to an ascending tract that would let you become conscious of this action. So we see that divergence happening in this figure, where the incoming sensory impulse, once we get in the gray matter, notice that the axon branches, the site of divergence. The impulse will travel down both parts of that axon. It will not only stimulate that inner neuron, which will finish the reflex arc, but it will result in an impulse traveling up an ascending tract to the brain. All right, so we're going to look at a couple of specific examples of reflex arcs. This illustration features the patellar reflex. This is a pretty commonly used test of local nervous system function. So the patient or the subject is sitting with their lower leg dangling free. And check out the green arrow there on the right side of the image. If you tap with a rubber hammer on the patellar ligament just below the kneecap, by tapping at that spot, what you're doing is pushing in on the patellar ligament, which pulls on the patellar tendon, which then pulls on the quadriceps muscle. You're stretching the quadriceps muscle. And if the tap was sufficient, what you've done is stimulated a sensory structure in the quadriceps muscle called the spindle. When the spindle is stretched, an action potential is generated that enters the spinal cord through a sensory neuron. A connection is directly made now with a motor neuron that innervates that same muscle, and the muscle contracts. So the tapping of the tendon results in a twitch-like contraction of the muscle. Another very common example of a reflex is a withdrawal reflex. This would happen when you receive a painful stimulus. So in this example, the person has stepped on a tack, stimulated pain receptors in the skin of the foot. An action potential is conducted along a sensory neuron up to the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, enters the gray matter of the spinal cord, makes a connection to an interneuron, which then stimulates a motor axon to cause muscles to contract that would pull your foot away from that, withdraw your foot from that painful stimulus. Notice also there's a divergence point there where the impulse would travel up an ascending tract to your brain to make you conscious of this. But hopefully by the time your brain receives that, you have already pulled your body part away from the offensive stimulus. Now finally, we can add one more piece to this with draw reflex puzzle. At the divergence point where the sensory neuron enters the posterior horn of the gray matter, notice there's a three-way branching. So one branch finishes the withdrawal reflex. A second branch crosses over to the other side of the spinal cord and makes a connection to muscles on the opposite leg that will extend that leg. So if you're walking along and step on something, if you pull your right leg away from the stimulus, you're going to have to extend your left leg to support your weight. That's all reflexive. That's called a crossed extensor reflex.